I'm going to talk about translation here, really from the perspective of reception, how people receive translations, as opposed to the general perspective that we adopt, which is that of the translator. But first, let me situate you as a translator. You have an L1, your first language, which was spoken and became written, so we could call that L1.5 if you like. And there are all kinds of degrees of writtenness, of course. And you're pretty good because you have an L2, all right? And some of you can write in that L.25 as well. Many of us have L3s, L4s, L5s, etc. And we think we're pretty good, okay, with all those. Let's say that's you with those languages. But we know that in the city of Melbourne, more than 250 languages are spoken in homes. So you, within the linguistic life of the city, you know about that much of it. You think you know a lot of things, but really a lot's going on that we don't know about. We don't know about those other languages. We don't know about the experience of the people in those languages. And then if we put you among the more than 6,000 languages spoken in the world, the ethnologue estimate is currently closer to 7,000, and they're dying at an alarming rate. But here you are. This is what you know about the linguistic experience, the felt, lived cultural experience of those other languages out there. And of course, if we bring in a time dimension of, let's say, 350,000 years, you are a mere speck which can't be seen. I don't even know if I put a speck in that diagram to try to indicate how much, or rather, how little we know of the lived experience of humanities through the languages that we know. What am I trying to get at here? The experience of humanity, if you want to know what it is to be human and what humans have experienced, has come to us from that vast expanse of unknown languages, has come to us in some way through translation. It has been appropriated or assimilated through translation. And that's quite a thought, if you think about it, that we have been relying on translation somehow for much of our experience and much of our sense of where we are in the world. And the problems are, firstly, people don't know it. We consume news daily on any media you like without being aware that it has come to us through processes of translation. And worse, we generally don't care about it. Why? We want to know that bit of news very quickly, and we consider the translation transparent to what came before it, as we say, transparent to the ST. Now, that might be a problem. Here's a literary translator in a recent expression of discontent with this particular problem. So I care a lot about translation, and you can read the translator, in this case from Turkish, is complaining that his projects are not getting accepted, not getting published, that in the world of English language literature, translations get very little foothold. And he is thinking of giving up the task. Let's see what he says here. It's time to hang up your hat, to move on, to admit that the Sisyphean task of advocating for these books is just that, Sisyphean. Sisyphus was the guy that rolled the boulder up the slope, and then it rolled down, and he had to do it every day. A labor, a senseless labor, working too hard and not getting anywhere. And that's a pretty common feeling among literary translators from many languages these days, that it's a labor of love, that we want to open the English language to that vast wealth of human experience that I've tried to indicate, and that not just the publishing system, but the readers of literature are not paying attention. We get the feeling that uh, we are engaged in a useless task. Now, I want to think about this problem, and I don't have a solution to it, I'll warn you. I'm thinking about the problem and thinking about ways to solve that problem, which is to make people aware of translations and to make translations a greater part of the cultural experience that we are aware of. So, one of my starting points here is the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, who you can see there. And Luhmann is deceptively attractive to people who work with languages and communication because his idea of social relations is that we live in systems and the systems comprise pure communication. So from the start, it seems very attractive. However, Luhmann doesn't help us, particularly if we work on translation, because in translation, we think we are working on communication between systems. But Luhmann says explicitly, there is no communication between systems. And if you look at his works on the various systems, particularly the legal system, but the system of art as well, and mass media, he does sort of assume a monolingual system and has very little to say about communication between language systems. What does he say then? What does happen between systems if not communication? Well, he has certain words to describe that. And this is where it gets interesting for me. One of them is irritation. Irritation is when a system becomes the environment of another system and generates resonance to events in the environment. Okay, so it's like ships, and they're not talking to each other, and they sort of touch each other, hit each other, and boom, there's a resonance. There is an event. So these terms, irritation, resonance, event, become of some interest to me. Goes on, this is from his work on the mass media, where he makes very good observations about the need of the mass media to create the new constantly, to create news as part of its systemic mission. Anyway, the concept of irritation explains a two-part nature, etc. One is deviation from what is already known. There is something there, something new. And the second is that this thing, this event, may lead to a restructuring of the system. So even though there's nothing that Luhmann wants to call communication going on here, there is attention, there is the idea that there is something new, and there is the potential for a change in reaction to that event. It goes on. Irritation is a part of all aesthetic experience, and I think I will be talking more about aesthetic experience than anything else here. And just the phrases: emerges from self-irritation, sheer delight in self-irritation and provocation, that there is a certain pleasure in this non-communication, and this does fit in with a certain modernist and postmodernist aesthetics. But Luhmann takes it back, and he takes it back to a Greek term that does appear in the Bible, in the New Testament, for wonder and marvel. Okay, but also, and I looked up that, and the Greek didn't really get me very far, but admiratio, his final term here, a Latin term, did get me somewhere. Not to modern or postmodern aesthetics, but to this philosopher, who's probably the philosopher I would never cite normally because of the Cartesian subject that nobody really believes in. However, Descartes, writing on the passions of the soul, les passions de l'âme, talks about a particular passion, and that passion is admiratio, or admiration, if you like. When, upon first encounter, an object surprises us and we esteem it new or quite different from what we knew before or from what we supposed it should be, then we admire it and we are astonished by it. And what I like here is that in Descartes' analysis of the passions, every passion has its opposite: love, hate, and so on, except for this one. This is why Descartes says admiration is the first of the passions. It has no opposite, since if the object has nothing that surprises us, we are not moved by it and we observe it without passion. So to have passion, we must first have this admiratio. I don't think admiration is a good translation of it, but it's like we don't know if it's going to be good or bad for us, and we say, "Whoa, there's something there." It's not, "Wow, this is good." It's, "Whoa, wait a minute. Let me find out about this. I don't know if it's good or bad yet. Let me investigate. Let me see." And that moment, I think, is what is missing in a lot of the translations that very good, dedicated translators are struggling to get published or struggling to get recognition for. It's that instant there that interests me. Now, many people are thinking along these lines. I'm not inventing anything new here, obviously. And many of my colleagues these days would cite Alain Badiou, whom you can see there, who comes from the days of hardcore Marxism. And Badiou's idea, or his aesthetics of the event, is that people will believe in creating a positive future simply through belief, simply through faith, not necessarily through having proof. He was talking against Marxism as a science that would mathematically lead to a great prosperous future for all. He believed and believes still that the event is what motivates people. There is no proof of the event, nor is the event a proof. And there are many references for him. One of them goes back to St. Paul, or Paul of Tarsus, who wrote on this at great length in his letters, in the letter to Corinthians, the first letter. My grace is sufficient to you. It is not, I cannot prove that Christ has risen from the dead. You will believe this. This speaks to a post-truth world, obviously, where there is no proof and people will believe because of the event and their involvement in it and their passion in it. And some people would like translations to work in that way. I personally have some reservations about the aesthetics of the event, or of people believing in something for which there is no proof. And I really do think that a year of pandemic has raised serious questions for our post-truth world, when nature speaks back to you and says, "You know what? If you don't do it right, you die." That's the same for COVID-19 communication as it is for climate emergency communication. You know what? We might also need some proof. My reservations about the aesthetics of the event here, which it seems to me goes too far, can also refer back to some wonderful, masterful events like the orchestrated Nuremberg rallies, which created converts or beliefs in National Socialism, for example. And I think that example is one reason why German thinkers on this problem, notably Gadamer, do not go into the event, do not go into lived experience as being enough. Gadamer, in his work on hermeneutics, on how we interpret texts, does say that we need effective involvement. Vorwurf is his name for it. We have to have prejudice, which is how that term is translated in our engagement with texts, but he refrains from reducing interpretation to pure experience without evidence. And that, I think, is the historical reason why. But that's, I'm moving away from translation here. Let me get back to it. Okay. Now, I'm looking for then an event of some kind that is somehow prior to the division into separate audiences, for and against type things. An event that somehow does need the text and does need evidence. It's not just getting up and presenting a translation and saying, this is what I think that should have said. Okay, it's not just doing your own thing. I think that's going too far and can lead to disastrous political and ecological consequences. But I'm looking for something that opens to the space of the other to potential irritation. As I said, I don't have solutions. I'm just giving you ideas that I'm working on here, trying to find a way through. Performativity is another way of addressing this same problem. I will get to translations in a minute. My examples are coming up. But consider this, that there may be two ways of receiving a translation, too many, but we can formalize it in this way. This is the text, comma, translated by translator. So if I want to know what a particular law is in a different country, I can go to the translation of the law. If I'm Canada, I can find the law in French and the law in English, and they're all parallel. And I will be totally uninterested in this part translated by the translator. I'm reading that law to get the information, and I read it in a constative way. This text will will tell me what is in that other text, and I will believe it because I have to. I have no other recourse if I'm reading that way. However, I can also approach it as the text, the absent text, the ST, as translated by the translator. And there I'm watching the translator's performance, and I'm aware of that performative aspect, that the individual translator has intervened in the recreation, representation, transformation of this text. And that is a performative way of looking at translation, or at translation indeed, as a performance. It seems to me that that first way of reading translations is incredibly common when we don't have any recourse to any other way of getting to the text. What else can we do but have trust in the translator? However, this second way is also common in some cultural fields, particularly in fields where other translations are possible, when we have alternative means to access that absent ST. And I'm very interested in the possibilities that are opened by technology. The fact that if we have doubts about that translation there, I'm not too sure of the way that Canadian law has been translated into French. I can, for example, even if I don't know French, I can put it through machine translation, and everybody can get their own translation and use that to interrogate it. Or I can go into DeepL and click on all the synonyms that could have been used. And that way I will interrogate the translation and think of alternatives. The translator and he wrote the textbook on revision. Brian Mossop actually did this in Canada, questioning the Canadian law on marriage. When at the stage when it was done, the English text talked about a man and a woman, and the French text talked about les époux, which didn't specify a man and a woman. And Brian used this to bring a legal suit against the Canadian government, saying that the French reading should prevail for same-sex marriage. And that's where people became aware, you know what? It's a translation problem. There has been a translator here, and we've got to talk about this difference between languages and to fix up the Constitution. Okay, technology enables wonderful things to be done. This is one that I have a master student working on as we speak. Okay, he's finishing his thesis now. Dan Maku are these timed comments or pop-ups that flashes across the screen from right to left as people are watching online in China and in Japan. And they are audience members talking about the product and having a conversation. And if it's in a foreign language, giving translations, giving alternative translations, discussing the translations in these comments, pop-ups that flash across the screen. I find that a wonderfully innovative mode of reception. And it seems that some people have a lot of fun doing this, participating as a community online in the reception and translation of the product. And this would be, for me, an example of absolutely performative translation. More tame examples. This is 500, is it? 300, 500, 300 was it? Film about Greeks against the Persians. And I know this, I mean, I knew the story from a long time. I know about the Battle of Thermopylae. And Thermopylae, I know where that is, and I know about the battle. But in the film, they start talking about the Hot Gates battle. I think, well, that's weird. How is it that what I think was Thermopylae is Hot Gates? And then I can see, oh, therm, oh, heat. Yes, Thermopylae means the Hot Gates. And the film is telling me something about the difference between the languages. And it's actually a retranslation of my own former knowledge of this event, mirrored in the form of dialogues within the film there. This one is from Spartacus, though, where we have wonderful phrases like open mouth and lend voice to tongue. I think, wow, this must be how it is in Latin. Okay, it's certainly not normal English, but that can be done in quite popular audiovisual products. Another well-known example, I'm picking up basically Australian examples here, or by pseudo-Australians like Mel Gibson. The Passion of the Christ went back and resurrected the original languages as much as is possible with Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew in the film, so that one had to depend on the subtitles to believe it, but we were constantly aware of the multilingual nature of the events and of our distance from that and of the mediation of translation, being a highest grossing non-English language film with great success until Wolf Warrior 2 came along and beat it. Okay, another Mel Gibson film, Apocalypto, is in Mayan, resurrecting the language as well, using subtitles, but making the role of language mediation very, very clear, in fact, unavoidable. If we go to more normal literary print translation, we find that these days we do have access to multiple translations of, for example, the classic texts. Okay, this is from Herodotus. It's translated from Greek. This is, I got it. Felderbaum is an incredibly literal translation. So this is just an example. Then after that, for the omens to be favorable for the Spartiates when they were making sacrifices for themselves was not possible. And that, for a long time, was theirs. You think, wait a minute, what does that mean? What it means is it's writing Greek syntax in English and giving it to us as it was. But I can turn over and find a more recent note. This is the Loeb translation, I think, Macaulay. After this event, it was not possible for the Spartans, when they sacrificed, to obtain favorable omens. This was the case with them for a long time. And we can buy the true translations together or get them online together and read one into the other. So if something's strange here or sounds suspect, we can go back here and follow more closely what was being done in the Greek. And we are aware of language mediation. When we do this, the two become performative. Neither of them represents exactly what is in the Greek. Another example, this case, more literature. I'm moving towards literature. As you can see, this is a famous poem by Ezra Pound, The Jewel Stairs Grievance. It's a translation of this poem over here, which you can see is quite short. What happens when it's translated? We get a more or less literary translation of what's in the text here, but we have added a title, which is not in the original, added a note to the author, added a long explanation of how these various images hang together. The whole is considered a translation. As much as we would just like to call that the translation, it's presented as a whole and should be considered as a whole, inescapably performative. Pound is telling us what's in the text and how it can be read. Gayatri Spivak is another very creative translator. Her work on the Bengali woman writer Mahasweta Devi, in some cases, occupies more than the actual translation. So this one, Breast Stories, for example, I calculated that we've got Devi's name here, and down the bottom we've got Spivak's name, but only 42%. 75 pages are the translation. We've got Spivak's introduction to it. We've got her work on Devi. I think there's an interview with Devi. And the book is as much about the translation as it is the translation itself. Another example from Spivak is her translation from French, in this case, of Derrida's of Grammatology. And she has a long, long introduction to it, talking about the translation and her meeting with Derrida and positioning herself as a very active translator. And then she has this wonderful conclusion to her introduction, where her introductory discourse overlaps with the beginning of the text itself. This is how the actual text begins, the translation begins, the first part of this book, etc. But you can see that has been inserted here into her conclusion of the introduction, which is nice. It's an innovation where the two normally separate discourses, the translator as invisible mediator, the translator as introducer of the text, here with a first person, here with no first person, here the two overlap to indicate that it is indeed the same person. I'm sorry if I'm being too abstract for you. I'm getting to a very practical task at the end, don't worry. Another form of innovation comes from Clive Scott, who is actually a very, very good analyst of verse forms, particularly in French. Here, though, he takes the position that a translation is always a reading of a text, the way one person reads the text, and that the translation should include that person's interpretations. So here we have him translating this English language text, which is about a train station where the train stops, and it's summer, late June, and we have lots of sounds and birds and things around the person at this train stop. So what Clive Scott does is translate this into this English text, which is using what's called concrete poetry. You can see it's been rewritten so that it's either a tree or a big wasp that you can see there, both of which fit in with what's experienced in the text. and then we have the sounds and names of the birds being put around it. And so this was the translation from English into English. What's happening, of course, is we've got it from one medium, linguistic medium, into the use of language as a visual medium here. And Clive Scott says quite justifiably, look, we have all these things we can do with the printed page. Why not use them? This is the front cover of his book. You can see there the same poem that we just saw, and he's put choreography on top of it. It could be a dance, he says, as well. That can also be a translation.